In the summer of 1944, while the eyes of the world were fixed on the beaches of Normandy and the Allied landings in France, an even greater storm was gathering far to the east, beyond the forests and swamps of Belarus, where the Red Army was preparing to unleash the most devastating offensive operation of the Second World War. The Germans believed the main Soviet blow would fall in Ukraine or against the Balkans. They were wrong. What followed would become known as Operation Bagration, a campaign so massive, so destructive, and so brilliantly concealed that it would wipe an entire German army group from the map in less than a month and permanently shattered the Wehrmacht's ability to wage war on the Eastern Front. By June 1944, Nazi Germany was already fighting for survival. The Eastern Front had become a slow, grinding catastrophe. The defeat at Stalingrad, the collapse at Kursk, and the retreat across Ukraine had cost Hitler millions of soldiers and enormous quantities of equipment. Yet despite these disasters, the German High Command still believed it could stabilize the front. They placed their faith in their strongest remaining formation, Army Group Center, deployed across Belarus. It was here that the Germans believed the Soviets would never dare to attack. The region was covered with forests, rivers, marshes, and broken infrastructure. German generals believed it was unsuitable for large-scale mechanized warfare. They believed it was safe. They were catastrophically wrong. For months, Soviet planners under Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky prepared an operation of unprecedented scale. Over 2.3 million soldiers, 6,000 tanks, 30,000 artillery pieces, and 5,300 aircraft were secretly positioned along a 1,100-kilometer front. Entire armies were moved at night. Bridges were built under camouflage. Rail lines were repaired in secret. Divisions vanished from one sector and reappeared hundreds of kilometers away without German intelligence detecting their movement. This was maskaraka, the ancient Russian art of deception, elevated to a science. Fake radio transmissions created phantom armies. Dummy tank divisions were constructed from wood and canvas. False supply depots were built and deliberately discovered by German reconnaissance aircraft. Meanwhile, the striking fist, was assembling silently behind the forests of Belarus. German intelligence saw none of it. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Ernst Busch, was stretched thin across a massive front. It consisted of the 4th Army, 9th Army, 3rd Panzer Army, and 2nd Army, nearly 800,000 men. Hitler believed this force was secure. He refused to allow any retreat. He ordered his generals to hold every position to the last man. The trap was set. On June 22, 1944, exactly 3 years after Germany had launched Operation Barbarossa, the Red Army struck back. At dawn, the skies over Belarus erupted in fire. Tens of thousands of artillery guns opened simultaneously. The earth shook as entire German defensive lines were obliterated in minutes. Soviet aircraft swarmed over German positions, destroying headquarters, bridges, rail yards, and supply columns. Communication lines were severed. Entire divisions were cut off before they even knew an offensive had begun. The German front collapsed almost instantly. In the north, Soviet forces smashed through the German 3rd Panzer Army near Vitebsk. Within days, 5 German divisions were surrounded and annihilated. Vitebsk fell. The road to the Baltic was open. In the center, the 4th Army was encircled east of Minsk. Soviet tank armies drove deep into German rear areas, cutting off escape routes and sealing the pocket. More than 100,000 German soldiers were trapped. Few would survive. In the south, Bobruisk became another death trap. The 9th Army was shattered. Tens of thousands were killed trying to break out across open fields under Soviet artillery fire. The speed of the Soviet advance stunned even their own commanders. Entire German corps disappeared in days. Headquarters were overrun. Generals were captured. Maps became useless as the front dissolved into chaos. Within 1 week, Army Group Center had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Hitler responded with fury. He dismissed Field Marshal Busch and replaced him with the famous fireman of the Eastern Front, Walter Model. But even Model could not save the situation. He arrived to find an army group that had already been destroyed. Divisions existed only on paper. Roads were choked with refugees, wounded soldiers, and shattered columns of equipment. The Red Army advanced at a rate not seen since the German Blitzkrieg of 1941. On July 3, Minsk fell. More than 100,000 German troops were paraded through the city as prisoners of war. The Soviet victory was total. The German front had been ripped open. The road to Poland lay undefended. By the end of July, Soviet forces had advanced over 600 kilometers. Belarus was completely liberated. Eastern Poland was entered. The Red Army stood on the banks of the Vistula River, less than 200 kilometers from Berlin. The cost to Germany was catastrophic. Over 500,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. 28 divisions were completely destroyed. Another 12 were rendered combat ineffective. More German losses were suffered during Operation Bagration than during the Battle of Stalingrad. It was the single greatest defeat in the history of the German army. The psychological impact was just as devastating. The myth of German military invincibility was shattered forever. The officer corps knew the war was lost. Even Hitler privately admitted that Germany could no longer win, only delay the inevitable. Meanwhile, the Red Army had proven itself as the most powerful land force on earth. Bagration was not just a military victory. It was a demonstration of operational art on a scale never before achieved. The coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, air power, and logistics was flawless. Soviet commanders executed deep battle doctrine with precision. Multiple fronts advanced simultaneously, preventing German reserves from being redeployed. Every breakthrough was immediately exploited by mechanized formations driving deep into the rear. German counterattacks were crushed before they could form. The partisan war behind German lines played a decisive role. Tens of thousands of Soviet partisans sabotaged railways, destroyed bridges, ambushed supply columns, and assassinated German officers. Entire German divisions were forced to divert manpower to rear area security while the front collapsed. The deception campaign was equally brilliant. Until the final hours, German intelligence believed the main Soviet offensive would come in Ukraine. Even as Soviet artillery began firing in Belarus, some German commanders still believed it was a diversion. They never understood what hit them. Operation Bagration marked the moment when the strategic initiative passed irreversibly to the Red Army. From that summer onward, Germany would fight a defensive war on all fronts. The Wehrmacht would retreat from Poland, from the Baltic, from Hungary, from Romania. One by one, Germany's allies would abandon Hitler. Less than a year later, Soviet troops would storm Berlin. The road to the Reichstag began in the forests of Belarus. Today, Operation Bagration remains one of the most important yet least understood campaigns of the Second World War. Overshadowed in the West by D-Day, it was in fact far larger in scale and far more decisive in its impact. While Allied forces fought to break out of Normandy, the Red Army destroyed the core of Germany's military power in the east. As the Red Army surged westward in the wake of Bagration, the scale of the destruction left behind became impossible to hide. German field reports spoke of entire regiments vanishing, of supply columns annihilated from the air, of armored units destroyed before they could even form defensive lines. Roads were littered with burned-out vehicles. Abandoned artillery pieces lay rusting in ditches. Horses, once the backbone of German logistics, lay dead by the thousands along the retreat routes. The Wehrmacht was no longer retreating in order. It was fleeing. German soldiers who survived the encirclements described Bagration as a nightmare without end. Soviet artillery followed them day and night. Fighters and ground attack aircraft hunted anything that moved. Tank columns appeared suddenly from forests, and swamps the Germans believed were impassable. No rear area was safe. No road was secure. No headquarters could operate without fear of destruction. The Red Army had learned from every defeat of the previous 3 years. The disasters of 1941, when Soviet armies were encircled by German panzer groups, were now being inflicted upon the Wehrmacht itself. The doctrine of deep battle, conceived in the 1930s and nearly forgotten during the chaos of the early war, was now executed with terrifying precision. The opening artillery barrage alone was unprecedented. In some sectors, Soviet guns were deployed at a density of over 250 barrels per kilometer. Entire German trench systems were erased in minutes. Bunkers collapsed. Command posts were buried. Survivors emerged deaf, blinded, and shell-shocked, only to be overrun by advancing infantry supported by tanks and flamethrowers. The Soviet assault groups moved with ruthless efficiency. Engineers cleared minefields under fire. Sappers built bridges across rivers within hours. Pontoon units followed tank armies across swamps that German planners had deemed impassable for armor. The Red Army was no longer a blunt instrument. It had become a perfectly synchronized war machine. German resistance was fierce in places, especially among veteran units that had fought since 1941. But courage could not compensate for the collapse of logistics and command. Fuel shortages immobilized panzer divisions. Ammunition shortages forced artillery units to abandon their guns. Communications were so disrupted that some German commanders did not even know their neighboring units had been destroyed. In one infamous case, near Minsk, a German corps commander attempted to organize a breakout without knowing that his entire flank no longer existed. His force marched directly into a Soviet tank army and was annihilated within hours. The destruction of Army Group Center created a strategic vacuum. For the first time since 1941, there was no coherent German front between the Red Army and Berlin. German reserves were exhausted. New divisions existed only on paper. Hitler's last strategic reserve, the panzer divisions in France, were now locked in battle against the Western Allies and could not be transferred east. Germany was bleeding on 2 fronts, and it could not survive either. The Soviet advance continued relentlessly. Vilnius fell after brutal street fighting. Brest-Litovsk, the fortress city that had resisted for weeks in 1941, was retaken in days. The Red Army crossed into Poland, greeted by both liberation and fear. For many Poles, Soviet victory meant the end of Nazi terror, but also the beginning of a new political reality. Behind the front, the NKVD followed closely, securing territory and dismantling German administration. Partisan units emerged from the forests to join the advancing armies. The entire region had become one vast battlefield. The logistical achievement of Bagration was as extraordinary as its combat success. Soviet rail troops repaired thousands of kilometers of track under combat conditions. Supply depots moved forward with the armies. Fuel, ammunition, food, and medical support flowed in a continuous stream. Wounded soldiers were evacuated with unprecedented speed. Replacement units were fed directly into the advance. By July, the Red Army was advancing faster than its own maps could be updated. German attempts to form a new defensive line along the Vistula failed. Soviet bridgeheads were established under fire. Tank armies crossed rivers on makeshift pontoons, while artillery fired directly over their heads. German counterattacks were smashed by overwhelming firepower before they could even reach Soviet positions. In desperation, Hitler ordered the creation of new fortress cities, strongpoints that were to be held at all costs. Warsaw, Krakow, and Königsberg were declared fortresses. Garrisons were ordered to fight to the last man. Retreat was forbidden. But the lesson of Bagration was clear. Fortresses could be bypassed, isolated, and destroyed at leisure. The psychological collapse within the German command structure was profound. Officers no longer trusted intelligence reports. Orders from Berlin were openly criticized. Some commanders disobeyed Hitler's stand-fast directives and withdrew without permission, knowing that to stay meant annihilation. By August, even the most fanatical Nazis could see the truth. The war was lost. In the east, Romania and Bulgaria began secret negotiations with the Allies. Hungary searched for a way out. Finland sued for peace. Germany's coalition was unraveling under the pressure of Soviet advances. All of it traced back to Bagration. The operation had destroyed not only an army group, but Germany's entire strategic position in Eastern Europe. The Reich had lost its eastern shield. Its oil supplies were threatened. Its allies were abandoning it. Its cities were being bombed day and night. And now the Red Army was approaching the borders of the Reich itself. Soviet soldiers wrote in their diaries that they could feel the end approaching. They marched through lands that had once been conquered by Hitler's armies and now lay in ruins. They saw the remains of burned villages, mass graves, extermination camps. For many, Bagration was not just a military campaign. It was vengeance. The memory of Kiev, of Smolensk, of Stalingrad, of Leningrad, burned in every advance. The Red Army that crossed the Vistula in 1944 was no longer the shattered force of 1941. It was hardened, experienced, and relentless. Its commanders had mastered modern warfare. Its soldiers had learned how to survive, how to kill, how to advance under fire. They knew Berlin was waiting. Operation Bagration had opened the road. And once that road was opened, nothing could close it again. The forests of Belarus had swallowed an army. The plains of Poland would soon witness the fall of an empire. And from the ruins of the Reich would rise a new world order shaped by the guns that had first thundered on the morning of June 22, 1944, the day the Red Army returned the favor. The day history turned.